Thank you. Well, I presume most of you have been up all night. Can't imagine ever seeing this many programmers at 8 o'clock in the morning. Guess this is the largest bathroom I've ever given a talk in. So that was just a test to see if you could understand me. I can't actually understand myself up here. Now, actually haven't been to Uppsala since the first one, and when I got invited to give this talk, I was thinking about, well, should I go or should I not, or what should I do? And it occurred to me that this conference on this day is pretty much in the epicenter of the 25th anniversary of Smalltalk. The one-page interpreter scheme that I wrote out was done just a few weeks ago, 25 years ago, and the first working version of it was done a few weeks from now, 25 years ago. So this is about in the center, and let me see if I can get our motto up on. Could I have that first slide, please? So now, I thought one way, I'm not going to give a historical talk because I finally discharged those obligations in the History of Programming Languages conference a couple of years ago, but I thought it might be interesting for some of you who might not have been computing for the last 25 or 30 years to take a 2-minute trip. And I believe that this set of images basically goes back to 1973 and 1974 at Xerox PARC, shows some of the first children that we worked with. The music that you'll hear on this clip was composed by one of the members of our group, Chris Jeffers. It's called The Happy Hacker, in case you want a theme song. It is played in the real-time FM synthesis that we developed for the Alto computer. So this is the forerunner of the workstations and the Macintosh without any additional sound synthesis hardware at all, because why should you have that if your computer is designed well? And you'll just get I think you'll get a little picture of it. And before I turn on that clip, let's just for the heck of it see how many people are in this room today who participated in the Xerox PARC Smalltalk experience between roughly 1971 and 1983. Could you stand up? Let's see how many people are actually here. Anybody without gray hair? Thank you. Okay, let's roll that clip. Well, that was things as they existed about 25 years ago. And the other thing I want to do in the beginning part of this talk, I tried to figure out how to work my way into it, and I finally remembered the paper that Dijkstra, I don't know how many of you have ever met Dijkstra, but you probably know that arrogance in computer science is measured in nano Dijkstras. And he once wrote a paper of the kind that he liked to write a lot of, which had the title, "On the Fact That the Atlantic Has Two Sides." And it was basically all about how different the approaches to computing science were in Europe, especially in Holland, and in the United States. And there are many interesting, in the U.S. here, we were not mathematical enough, and in Holland, if you're a full professor, you're actually appointed by the Queen, and there are many other important distinctions made between the two cultures. So I wrote a rebuttal paper, which is called "On the Fact That Most of the Software in the World is Written on One Side of the Atlantic." And it was basically about, because I had a math degree too, it was basically about that computers form a new kind of math. You can't judge them. They don't really fit well into classical math, and people who try to do that are basically indulging in a form of masturbation, maybe even realizing it. And it was about that it was a kind of a practical math. That is, the balance was between making structures that were supposed to be consistent of a much larger kind than classical math had ever come close to dreaming of attempting, and having to deal with the exact same problems that classical math of any size has to deal with, which is being able to be convincing about having covered all of the cases. There was a mathematician by the name of Euler whose speculations about what might be true formed 20 large books, and most of them were true. Most of them were right. Almost all of his proofs were wrong. And many PhDs in mathematics in the last and this century have been formed by mathematicians going to Euler's books, finding one of his proofs, showing it was a bad proof, and then guessing that his insight was probably correct and finding a much more convincing proof. And so debugging actually goes on in mathematics as well. And I think that the main thing about doing OOP work or any kind of programming work is that there has to be some exquisite blend between beauty and practicality. There's no reason to sacrifice either one of those, and people who are willing to sacrifice either one of those, I don't think really get what computing is all about. It's like saying I have really great ideas for paintings, but I'm just going to use a brush but no paint. So my ideas will be represented by the gestures I make over the paper. And don't tell any 20th century artists that, or they might decide to make a videotape of them doing that and put it in a museum. So I thought I had this problem figuring out what to talk about. It's always difficult because technical people always seem to know so much. But it's interesting to look at what's actually being done out in the world under the name of OOP. And I've been shown some very, very strange looking pieces of code over the years by various people, including people in universities, that they have said is OOP code and written in an OOP language. And actually I made up the term object-oriented. And I can tell you I did not have C++ in mind. So the important thing here is I have many of the same feelings about small talk, and I'm going to try and I'm not going to try and do small talk in here, because I think there's one really important thing about small talk and some of the languages like it that we should pay really, really close attention to. But it has almost nothing to do with either the syntax or the accumulated superclass library, both of which of these are taken as being the language, as though it was issued from some gods on Olympus. So I want to talk a little bit more about my personal reaction to OOP when I started thinking about it in the 60s, and instead of making it a historical talk, to try and think about whether these reactions and insights have any place today. So I'll just move. So I guess my slide thing doesn't work. Maybe it does. Yeah, just go to there's a blank slide there. Just go to the next one. So in the 60s, things were quite mechanical. There was a sense of simple mechanism, because computers, of course, were as large as this room. Some of them, the one that Ivan Sutherland did Sketchpad on, was the size of this room. It was one of the last computers in the US large enough to have its own roof. It was the building it was in. But the programs were quite small, and they had a lot in common with their mathematical antecedents. And one way of thinking about the semantics of math that is based on logic is as interlocking gears. Everything kind of has to fit together, and if it does, and everything's compatible at the end, you get the final turning of the shaft that you want. And sort of a real-world analogy. Go to the next slide, please. Whoops. So we missed a slide. Go back 2 slides, please. There we go. So an analogy to these programs of the 60s is a doghouse. You take any random boards, nail and hammer, pound them together, and you've got a structure that will stay up. You don't have to know anything except how to pound a nail to do that. Now, somebody could come along and look at this doghouse and say, wow, if we could just expand that by a factor of 100, we could make ourselves a cathedral. It's about 3 feet high. That would give us something 30 stories high, and that would be really impressive. We could get a lot of people in there. And so the carpenters would set to work blowing this thing up by a factor of 100. Now, we all know, being engineers and scientists, that when you blow something up by a factor of 100, its mass goes up by a factor of 1,000,000. And its strength, which is mostly due to cross-sections of things, only goes up by a factor of 10,000. So when you blow something up by a factor of 100, it gets about a factor of 100 weaker in its ability. And in fact, what will happen to this doghouse, it will just collapse into a pile of rubble. And then there are 2 choices you can have when that happens. The most popular one is to say, well, that was what we were trying to do all along. Put more garbage on it, plaster it over with limestone, and say, yes, we were really trying to do pyramids, not Gothic cathedrals. That, in fact, I think accounts for much of the structure of modern operating systems today. Or you can come up with a new concept, which the people who started getting interested in complex structures many years ago did. They called it architecture. Literally, the designing and building of successful arches, a non-obvious, non-linear interaction between simple materials to give you non-obvious synergies and a vast multiplication of materials. It's quite remarkable to people when I tell them that the amount of material in Chartres Cathedral, which is an enormous physical structure, is less than the amount of material that was put into the Parthenon. And the reason is it's almost all air and almost all glass. Everything is cunningly organized in a beautiful structure to make the whole have much more integrity than any of its parts. So that's the other way you can go. And part of the message of OOP was that as complexity starts becoming more and more important, architecture is always going to dominate material. And in fact, the sad fact, I think, about OOP is people didn't get interested in architecture because of the beauty of it. They're only starting to get interested in architecture now when the internet is forcing everybody to do it. That's pretty pathetic. So I'm going to use a metaphor here for this talk, which is drawn from a wonderful book called The Act of Creation by Arthur Koestler. Koestler was a novelist who became a cognitive scientist in his later years. And one of the great books he wrote was about what might creativity be, learning. He realized that learning, of course, is an act of creation itself because something happens in you that wasn't there before. And he used the metaphor of thoughts as ants crawling on a plane. In this case, it's a pink plane. And there's a lot of things you can do on a pink plane. You can have goals, you can choose directions, you can move along, but you're basically always in the pink context. And if you think about that, it means that progress in a fixed context is almost always a form of optimization. Because if you were actually coming up with something new, it wouldn't have been part of the rules or the context for what the pink plane is all about. So creative acts generally are ones that don't stay in the same context that they're in. So he says every once in a while, even though you've been taught carefully by parents and by school for many years, you have a blue idea. Maybe when you're taking a shower, maybe when you're out jogging, maybe when you're resting in an unguarded moment, suddenly that thing that you were puzzling about, wondering about, looking at, appears to you in a completely different light, as though it were something else. And Koestler said the emotional reaction to this comes basically in three forms, which is, if you're telling a joke, it's ha-ha. If you're doing science, it's aha. And if you're doing art, it's ah. And he says because in each case, something very similar is happening. A joke takes you down the garden path and then suddenly reveals it's about something else, and you get a very aggressive explosion. And science has much of the same feeling to it, and often when you see something in science, you start laughing because it was right there in front of you, and it is a kind of a joke. And of course, art is there to remind us, great art is there to remind us that whatever context we think we're in, there are other contexts. Art is always there to take us out of the context that we're in and make us aware of other contexts. So this is a very simple, you could even call it a simple-minded metaphor, but it will certainly serve for this talk today. And he also pointed out that you have to have something blue to have blue thoughts with. And I think this is generally missed in people who specialize to the extent of anything else. When you specialize, you're basically putting yourself into a mental state where optimization is pretty much all you can do. You have to learn lots of different kinds of things in order to have the start of these other contexts. So here's a couple of knocks on the head I had over the years that I just want to tell them to you quickly. This one I think you'll find interesting because it is the earliest known form of what we call data abstraction. It goes all the way back, actually pre-1961. I was in the Air Force in 1961, and I saw it in 1961, and it probably goes back 1 year before. And so back then they didn't really have operating systems. They had, Air Training Command had to send tapes of many kinds of records around from Air Force Base to Air Force Base. There's a question of how could you deal with all of these things that used to be card images, and then because tape had come in, were starting to be more and more complicated formats. And somebody, almost certainly an enlisted man, because officers didn't program back then, came up with the following idea. This person said, on the third part of the record on this tape, we'll put all of the records of this particular type. The second part, the middle part, we'll put all of the procedures that know how to deal with the formats on this third part of the tape. And in the first part, we'll put pointers into the procedures. And in fact, let's make the first 10 or so pointers standard, like reading and writing fields and trying to print, and let's have a standard vocabulary for the first 10 of these, and then we can have idiosyncratic ones later on. And so all you had to do to read a tape back in 1961 was to read the front part of a record, one of these big records, into core storage and start jumping in direct through the pointers, and the procedures were there. Now, I really would like you to contrast that with what you have to do with HTML on the internet. Think about it. HTML on the internet has gone back to the dark ages because it presupposes that there should be a browser that should understand its formats. This has to be one of the worst ideas since MS-DOS. This is really a shame. It's maybe what happens when physicists decide to play with computers. I'm not sure. And in fact, we can see what's happened to the internet now is it's gradually getting, there are two wars going on. There's a set of browser wars which are 100% irrelevant. They're basically an attempt either at demonstrating a non-understanding of how to build complex systems, or a even cruder attempt simply to gather territory, which I suspect Microsoft is in the latter camp here. You don't need a browser if you followed what this staff sergeant in the Air Force knew how to do in 1961. You just read it in. It should travel with all the things that it needs, and you don't need anything more complex than something like X Windows, hopefully better. But basically, you want to be able to distribute all of the knowledge of all of these things that are there. And in fact, the internet is starting to move in that direction as people discover ever more complex HTML formats, ever more intractable. So this is one of these mistakes that has been recapitulated every generation. And it's just simply not the way to do it. So here's a great idea. And by the way, this this kind of programming was done before there were higher level languages in the Air Force, and this approach to things was forced out of the Air Force by COBOL when they standardized on COBOL. Ivan Sutherland's Sketchpad, I've usually shown a movie of what it was like. I won't today. Immensely sophisticated, almost staggering in its conception of what it was able to do. Very much an object-oriented system. It had an actual notion of classes and subclasses. It had a notion of polymorphism, even stronger than the Air Training Command version. Next slide, please. Now, I'd seen the idea 3 or 4 times, but it wasn't until I had to figure out Simula. We thought it was supposed to be an algol, and it turned out this pile of tapes was the first Simula, an algol that had been doctored by Case Western Reserve and the inventors of Simula, Nygaard and Dahl, in Norway, and distributed along with some incomprehensible documentation in 1966. And it was through trying to understand what Simula was that finally, I'm not sure exactly why, it's just, I think it's maybe if you see a good idea that's odd 4 times in 4 different costumes, it finally starts to make an impression. And here's the choice you have when you're faced with something new. You can take this technological advance and you could decide this is a better way of doing the stuff I'm doing now, and I can use this to continue on the path that I'm going. So that's staying in the pink plane. Or you can say, this is not a better old thing, this is almost a new thing, and I wonder what that new thing is trying to be. And if you do that, there's a chance of actually perhaps gaining some incredible leverage over simply optimizing something that can't be optimized very much. So the choice here was Simula came out of the world of data structures and procedures and had much of that flavor, if you wanted to look at it that way, but it had a way of making relationships of the states of your computation with procedures that was extremely helpful and much better and more general than the what were called own variables in Algol 60. So that was one way to think of it. Then there's this other question of if it was almost a new thing, what kind of a new thing was it? Well, one of my undergraduate majors was in molecular biology. And my particular interest was both in cell physiology and in embryology, morphogenesis they call it today. And this book, Molecular Biology of the Gene, had just come out in 1965. And wonderful book, still in print, and of course it's gone through many, many editions, and they're probably the only words that are common between this book and the one of today are the articles, like the and. Actually, the word gene, I think, is still in there, but it means something completely different now. But one of the things that Watson did in this book was to make an assay, first assay of an entire living creature, and that was the E. coli bacterium. Next slide, please. So if you look inside one of these, the complexity is staggering. Those popcorn things are protein molecules that have about 5,000 atoms in them. And as you can see on the slide, when you get rid of the small molecules like water and calcium ions and potassium ions and so forth, which constitute about 70% of the mass of this thing. The 30% that remains has about 120 million components that interact with each other in an informational way. And each one of these components carries quite a bit of information. And you can think of it, the simple-minded way of thinking of these things is it works kind of like Ops 5. There's a pattern matcher, and then there are things that happen if patterns are matched successfully. So the state that's involved in that is about 100 gigs. And you can multiply that out. Today it's only 100 desktops or so, but it's still pretty impressive as amount of computation. And maybe the most interesting thing about this structure is that the rapidity of computation seriously rivals that of computers today, particularly when you're considering it's done in parallel. For example, one of those popcorn-sized things moves its own length in just 2 nanoseconds. So one way of visualizing that is if an atom was the size of a tennis ball, then one of these protein molecules would be about the size of a Volkswagen, and it's moving its own length in 2 nanoseconds. That's about 8 feet on our scale of things. And can anybody do the arithmetic to tell me what fraction of the speed of light moving 8 feet in 2 nanoseconds is? Four times, yeah. 4 times the speed of light. Scale. So if you ever wondered why chemistry works, this is why. The thermal agitation down there is so unbelievably violent that we could not imagine it even with the aid of computers. There's nothing to be seen inside one of these things until you kill it, because it is just a complete blur of activity, and under good conditions it only takes about 15 to 18 minutes for one of these to completely duplicate itself. Okay, so that's a bacterium. And of course lots more is known today. Then another fact to relate this to us is that these bacteria are about 1/500th the size of the cells in our bodies, which instead of 120 million informational components have about 60 billion. And we have between 10 to the 12th and 10 to the 13th, maybe even more, of these cells in our body. And yet, only 50 cell divisions happen in a 9-month pregnancy. It only takes 50 cell divisions to make a baby. Actually, if you multiply it out, you realize you only need around 40. And the extra 10 powers of 10 are there because during the embryological process, many of the cells that are not fit in one way or another for the organism as a whole are killed. So things are done by over-proliferating, testing, and trimming to this much larger plant. And then, of course, each one of these structures, us, is embedded in an enormous biomass. So to a person whose blue context might have been biology, something like a computer could not possibly be regarded as being particularly complex or large or fast. Slow, small, stupid. That's what computers are. So the question is, how can we get them to realize their destiny? Next slide, please. because we're using a form of technology that Napoleon used, which, remember those semaphores across France? So the shift in point of view here is from mechanical. There's this problem. If you take things like dog houses, they don't scale by a factor of 100 very well. If you take things like clocks, they don't scale by a factor of 100 very well. Take things like cells, they not only scale by factors of 100, but by factors of 1 trillion. And the question is, how do they do it? And how might we adapt this idea for building complex systems? Okay, this is the simple one. This is the one, by the way, that C++ has still not figured out, though. There's no idea so simple and powerful that you can't get zillions of people to misunderstand it. So you must not allow the interior of any one of these things to be a factor in the computation of the whole. Okay, and this is only part of the story. It's not just the cell membrane is there to keep most things out as much as it is there to keep certain things in. And a lot of, I think, our confusion with objects is the problem that in our Western culture, we have a language that has very hard nouns and verbs in it. So our process words stink. So it's much easier for us when we think of an object, and I have apologized profusely over the last 20 years for making up the term object-oriented, because as soon as it started to be misapplied, I realized that I should have used a much more process-oriented term for it. Now, the Japanese have an interesting word which is called ma, spelled in English just M-A, ma. And ma is the stuff in between what we call objects. It's the stuff we don't see, because we're focused on the nounness of things rather than the processness of things. Whereas Japanese has a more process, feel-oriented way of looking at how things relate to each other. You can always tell that by looking at the size of a word it takes to express something that is important. So ma is very short. We have to use words like interstitial or worse to approximate what the Japanese are talking about. So the realization here, and it's not possible to assign this realization to any particular person because it was in the seeds of Sketchpad and in the seeds of the Air Training Command file system and in the seeds of Simula. And that is that once you have encapsulated in such a way that there is an interface between the inside and the outside, it is possible to make an object act like anything. And the reason is simply this, that what you have encapsulated is a computer. So you have done a powerful thing in computer science, which is to take the powerful thing you're working on and not lose it by partitioning up your design space. This is the bug in data procedures, data and procedure languages. And I think this is the most pernicious thing about languages like C++ and Java, is that they think they're helping the programmer by looking as much like the old thing as possible, but in fact they're hurting the programmer terribly by making it difficult for the programmer to understand what's really powerful about this new metaphor. So now, and again, people who are doing time-sharing systems had already figured this out as well. Butler-Lamson's thesis in 1965 was about that what you want to give a person on a time-sharing system is something that is now called a virtual machine, which is, not the same as what the Java VM is, but something that is as much like the physical computer as possible, but give one separately to everybody. Unix had that sense about it, and the biggest problem with that scheme is that a Unix process had an overhead of about 2,000 bytes just to have a process, and so it was going to be very difficult in Unix to let a Unix process just be the number 3. So you'd be going from 3 bits to a couple of thousand bytes, and you have this problem with scaling. So a lot of the problem here is both deciding that the biological metaphor is the one that is going to win out over the next 25 years or so, and then committing to it enough to get it so it can be practical at all of the levels of scale that we actually need. Then we have one trick we can do that biology doesn't know how to do, which is we can take the DNA out of the cells, and that allows us to deal with cystic fibrosis much more easily than the way it's done today. And systems do have cystic fibrosis, and some of you may know that cystic fibrosis today, for some people, is treated by infecting them with a virus, a modified cold virus, giving them a lung infection, but the defective gene for cystic fibrosis is in this cold virus, and the cold virus is too weak to actually destroy the lungs like pneumonia does, but it is strong enough to insert a copy of that gene in every cell in the lungs. And that is what does the trick. That's a very complicated way of reprogramming an organism's DNA once it has gotten started. So here's one that it is amazing to me that we haven't seen more of. For instance, one of the most amazing things to me of people who have been trying to put OOP on the internet is that I do not, and I'm hoping somebody will come up afterwards and tell me of an exception to this, but I do not know of anybody yet who has realized that at the very least, every object should have a URL, because what the heck are they if they aren't these things? And I believe that every object on the internet should have an IP, because that represents much better what the actual abstractions are of physical hardware to the bits. So this is an early insight that objects basically are like servers, and this notion of polymorphism, which used to be called generic procedures, is a way of thinking about classes of these servers. Everybody knows about that. And here's one that we haven't really faced up too much yet, that now we have to construct this stuff, and soon we'll be required to grow it. So it's very easy, for instance, to grow a baby 6 inches. They do it about 10 times in their life, and you never have to take it down for maintenance. But if you try and grow a 747, you are faced with an unbelievable problem, because it's in this simple-minded mechanical world in which the only object has been to make the artifact in the first place, not to fix it, not to change it, not to let it live for 100 years. So let me ask a question. I won't take names, but how many people here still use a language that essentially forces you, in the development system, forces you to develop outside of the language, compile and reload and go, even if it's fast, like Virtual Cafe? How many here still do that? Let's just see. Come on, admit it. We can have a Texas tent meeting later. Yeah, so if you think about that, that cannot possibly be other than a dead end for building complex systems, where much of the building of complex systems is in part going to go to trying to understand what the possibilities for interoperability is with things that already exist. Now, I was just played a very minor part in the design of the ARPANET. I was one of 30 graduate students who went to systems design meetings to try and formulate design principles for the ARPANET, also about 30 years ago. And if you think about what the ARPANET, of course, became the Internet, and from the time it started running, which is around 1969 or so, to this day, it has expanded by about a factor of 100 million. So that's pretty good, 8 orders of magnitude. And there's, as far as anybody can tell, and I talked to Larry Roberts about this the other day, there's not one physical atom in the Internet today that was in the original ARPANET. And there's not one line of code in the Internet today that was in the original ARPANET. Of course, if we'd had IBM mainframes in the original ARPANET, that wouldn't have been true. So this is a system that has expanded by 100 million, has changed every atom and every bit, and has never had to stop. That is the metaphor we absolutely must apply to what we think are smaller things. When we think programming is small, that's why your programs are so big. That's why they become pyramids instead of Gothic cathedrals. Next. Okay, and here's the other big source. Certainly the greatest single language, along with Simula of the 60s, I think one with as many profound or more profound insights, Lisp. Now, on page 13 of this book that was published in 1962, there's a half page of code which is the reflective model of Lisp written in itself. All the important details of Lisp semantics and the guidelines for how to make a Lisp interpreter are in that half page. And it is this aspect, this meta-reflective aspect, that I think is to me, is the saddest thing about what's happening with Java. When Java first happened, I thought, well, it's legitimizing something that most people have not believed in for a long time, which is this bytecode approach of being multi-platform like we had at Xerox PARC. It's not a new idea. It actually goes back into the 60s. But when I looked at Java, I thought, my goodness, how could they possibly, and of course, we know that the history was more about programming toasters originally than being on the Internet, but my goodness, how do they hope to survive all of the changes, modifications, adaptations, and interoperability requirements without a meta system, without even, for instance, being able to load new things in while you're running? So to me, this is the fact that people adopted this as some great hope is probably the most distressing thing to me personally, as I said, since MS-DOS. I mean, it represents a real failure of people to understand what the larger picture is and is going to be. Next slide. So this notion of metaprogramming, lots of different ways of looking at it. One of them is that any particular implementation is making pragmatic choices. And these pragmatic choices are likely not to be able to cover all of the cases at the level of efficiency and even at the level of richness required. And of course, this is standard OOP lore. This is why we encapsulate. We need to hide our messes. We need to have different ways of dealing with the same concepts in a way that does not distract the programmer. But in fact, it's also applicable, as the Lisp people found and we at Xerox PARC found, you can also apply it to the building of the language itself. The more the language can see its own structures, the more liberated you can be from the tyranny of a single implementation. I think this is one of the most critical things that very few people are worrying about in a practical form. One of the reasons why this meta stuff is going to be important in such a way that nobody will be able to ignore it is this whole question of how do we really operate on the internet 5 and 10 years from now. And if you think about it, I don't believe Microsoft is going to be able to capture the internet. I think it's too big. I think there are too many people supplying ideas into it. And I think that people are going to be sophisticated enough to realize that an IBM or a Microsoft type solution is simply neither called for nor possible. What that means is there are going to be dozens and dozens, there almost already are, dozens and dozens of different object systems, all with very similar semantics, but with very different pragmatic details. And if you think of what a URL actually is, and you think of what an HTTP message actually is, and if you think of what an object actually is, and if you think of what an object-oriented pointer actually is, I think it should be pretty clear that any object-oriented language can internalize its own local pointers to any object in the world, regardless of where it was made. That's the whole point of not being able to see inside. And so a semantic interoperability is possible almost immediately by simply taking that stance. So this is going to change really everything, and things like Java Beans and Corba are not going to suffice, because at some point one is going to have to start really discovering what objects think they can do. And this is going to lead to a universal interface language, which is not a programming language per se. It's more like a prototyping language, but that allows an interchange of deep information about what objects think they can do. It allows objects to make experiments with other objects in a safe way to see how they respond to various messages. This is going to be a critical thing to automate in the next 10 years. Next slide. So here's a great book. How many people have read this book? Okay, so when they wrote this book, I called them up and I said, this is the best book anybody's written in 10 years, but why the hell did you write it in such a Lisp-centric, closed, club-centric way? This is a hard book for most people to read. If you don't know the Lisp culture, it's very hard to read. If you don't know how CLOS is done, it's a very hard book to read. But this book has some of the most profound insights about, and the most practical insights about OOP than anybody has done in the last many years. So I really commend it to you, and if there are any university professors here who would like to get the next Limoges balloon, I will give it to anybody who rewrites that book so that the general object-oriented community can understand it. It would be a great service to mankind. So what happened in most of the world, starting in the 70s, was abstract data types, which is really staying with an assignment-centered way of thinking about programming. And I believe that, in fact, when I made this slide, C++ was just sort of a speck on the horizon. It's one of those things like MS-DOS that nobody took seriously because who would ever fall for a joke like that? Next slide, please. Actually, my favorite C++ story is at Apple, there was this operating system remarkably, coincidentally named Pink. It was so great. And there are two interesting features of this new operating system that they're working on. One was it was always going to be done in 2 years. And you know, we have known some really great operating systems designers over the years, and I do not know of any decent operating system that's ever been done in 2 years, even by people who had 10 times the IQ of the Pink people. And the other thing about it was that it was going to be done in C++ for efficiency. Oh, let's not do it in Smalltalk, that's too slow. Well, let me tell you, there's nothing more inefficient than spending 10 years on an operating system that never works. Actually, the worst ones are the ones that appear to work. So let's take our Pink plane, and we can also use this McLuhan quote, my favorite McLuhan quote. I don't know who discovered water, but it wasn't a fish. And he meant us as the fish, and he meant water as our belief structures, as our context. And I believe this is the single, if you had to pick one cause of both particular difficulty in our field and also general difficulty in the human race, it's taking single points of view and committing to them like they're religions. This happened with Smalltalk. There's a wonderful quote by Schopenhauer, German philosopher of the 19th century, who said, every idea goes through 3 stages. First, it's denounced as the work of madmen. This is what Swift called a confederacy of dunces. And then later, it's remarked as being totally obvious the whole time. And then the last stage is when the original denouncers claim to have invented it. That's when it gets in its religious stage. Now, to me, the most distressing thing that happened to Smalltalk when it came out of Xerox PARC was, for many respects and purposes, it quit changing. And I can tell you at Xerox PARC, there are 4 major versions, completely different versions of the language over about a 10-year period, and many dozens and dozens of significant releases within those different versions. And I think one of the things that we liked the most about Smalltalk was not what it could do, but the fact that it was such a good vehicle for bootstrapping the next set of ideas we had about how to do systems building. And that, for all intents and purposes, when Smalltalk went commercial, ceased. And even though there was a book, the famous Blue Book that Adele and Dave wrote, that had the actual code in it for making Smalltalk interpreters and starting this process oneself, almost nobody took advantage of this. Almost no university took advantage of it. Almost no commercial institution took advantage of it. And what they missed was, to me, the deepest thing I would like to communicate with you today, and that is we don't know how to design systems yet. So let's not make what we don't know into a religion, for God's sakes. What we need to do is to constantly think and think and think about what's important. And we have to have our systems let us get to the next levels of abstraction as we come to them. And the thing that I'm most proud of about Smalltalk, pretty much the only thing from my standpoint that I'm proud of, is that it has been so good at getting rid of previous versions of itself. until it came out into this world. Now, one of the reasons we got involved in doing Smalltalk again, for me, it was 16 years of not working on programming languages. A couple of years ago, we started this project we call Squeak, which is simply not an attempt to give the world a free Smalltalk, but an attempt to give the world a bootstrapping mechanism for something much better than Smalltalk. And when you fool around with Squeak, please, please think of it from that standpoint. Think of how you can obsolete the damn thing by using its own mechanisms for getting the next version of itself. So, look for the blue thoughts. And I was trying to think of a way, how could I stop this talk? Because I'll go on. And I remembered a story. I'm a pipe organist. And most pipe organists have a hero whose name was E. Power Biggs. He kind of revived the interest in the pipe organ, especially as it was played in the 17th and 18th centuries, and had a tremendous influence on all of us organists. And a good friend of mine was E. Power Biggs' assistant for many years back in the 40s and 50s. He's in his 80s now. And when we get him for dinner, we always get him to tell E. Power Biggs stories. And the organ that E. Power Biggs had in those days for his broadcasts was a dinky little organ, neither fish nor fowl, in a small museum at Harvard called the Bush-Reisinger Museum. But in fact, all manner of music was played on it. And one day, this assistant had to fill in for Biggs, and he asked Biggs, well, what is the piece played? And he said, well, I had programmed Caesar Frank's heroic piece. And if you know this piece, it is made for the largest organs that have ever been made, the loudest organs that have ever been made, in the largest cathedrals that have ever been made, because it's a 19th century symphonic type organ work. And Biggs was asking my friend to play this on this dinky little organ. And he said, but how can I play it on this? And Biggsy said, just play it grand. Just play it grand. And the way to stay with the future as it moves is to always play your systems more grand than they seem to be right now. Thank you.